your microphone and computers while we're not in the question and answer period. We'll help keep some barking dogs and kids and whatever other background noise you might have at your place, since many of us are at home today. I'm lucky enough to be at the office where I don't have any of that, but it's just helpful and kind of keeps the feedback down. Regarding questions, if you do have questions, there's two ways to handle questions. If you don't want to forget it, either write it down or just send it to the chat button at the bottom of the screen there, and Marlon or I or Mark will get it here towards the end, and we'll start addressing those as we get towards the end. We were trying to find a way to do questions in the middle of everything, but with people's microphones off and on and off and on, it was just easier just to try to take those questions at the end. But you're welcome to unmute yourself when we get to the questions at the end and just ask, and we'll just talk through whatever we can. So first of all, thanks everybody for being here. This is kind of our first one. We decided that there was probably no better way that we could think of to connect with our clients kind of in this weird and strange time. So we want to kind of start this process with you guys and get this in. And we've got 6 of these planned over the next 6 weeks. Every Wednesday at 2:30, we're going to be on here talking about something. If you haven't seen the overall schedule, email one of us here at Veridus and we will get you the overall schedule, but it's on LinkedIn and we can get it. You'll probably see it a few more times out there. Today, we want to talk about project delivery methods. We have a lot of clients at Veridus that are in the private or the public sector, so cities and towns, governments, different groups like that, that are always trying to deal with different ways to deliver projects. So we wanted to talk about today, and Mark and I are going to do this. We're just going to go through project delivery methods, right? We titled this The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I don't know that there's really any ugly, so to speak, but there are some that we certainly feel, having been owners technical reps now for the last 8 years for lots of cities and towns, to understand the difference between how risk is allocated among those, and we'll get into that. So, Marlon, do we have anybody else joining here at all before I jump in? Okay, so we're just going to go. So today, you're going to hear from me. I think I know most of you. I don't know all of you, but my name is Tim Jensen. I'm the owner and president of the Veridus Group. Started it back in 2011, mainly for one reason, and that one reason was to represent project owners in complex projects. That's why we started it. And so a lot of what you're going to hear about is how we work with our clients every day to help explain their options to them, make sure they understand, and really our goal at the end of the day is that they make informed decisions. So I am born here in Indianapolis, spent a little bit of time away after college, went to Wisconsin, worked for a developer and a builder up there, got my feet wet in development and construction, moved back here in 2006, Purdue graduate.
Yeah, I just got a message.
My wife and I have 2 children, Caleb is 11 and Eli's 8. So we live up on the northeast side of Indianapolis, very active family, kids in sports, robotics, you name it. We feel like we're running, even only two kids are running each and every different direction. Mark, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Mark Griffith. I've been with Veridus now for coming up right on 2 years. My background is construction management. I have a degree from the University of Cincinnati. Spent an additional 15 years in Cincinnati doing commercial construction, and then moved back to Indianapolis a couple years ago, got into residential construction, and now I'm back into the commercial construction industry. I've got 2 little boys, 7 and 5, and I live on the north side of Indianapolis, south side of Carmel, and have been really enjoyed the opportunity to be owner's rep for several clients, a lot of cities and towns, and have the pleasure of doing 2 projects currently with the city of West Lafayette, who I think a couple are on the project, and we get to speak specifically about some of those projects and our experiences with project delivery methods that we'll discuss here in a few minutes.
Yeah, so a little bit more about our company real quick. I know this is not what this is about, so we just want to do this very quickly, and I'll let Mark kind of talk about his group, which is the first one, the Construction Services Group. We also have 3 other groups that do. Marlon runs our Community and Economic Development Group. He's on here today. Our Civil Engineering Group, they're all busy hitting a deadline for Friday. So they're working really hard right now on putting some of that out. And then we have a Building Forensics Group that is newer to us, about 6 months old, but that really does more property condition assessments, building enclosure commissioning, really kind of wrapping around all of our services around construction and development. without actually doing construction and development. We're kind of filling all those gaps and the voids around those markets. Mark, you want to talk a little more about what you do every day?
Yeah, so I spend a majority of my time in the owner's technical representation mode or line of work. And we really go in and try to be an extension of the staff of our clients, looking out for their best interests in all of their construction-related or capital improvement-related programs. We also do a handful of construction capital program management with working with clients to identify roadmaps to determine what their goals are with capital program improvements and putting those out on the calendar, identifying the appropriate team members to pursue, and trying to bring those visions to reality.
Good. So that's a quick synopsis on us. And if you join us for the next 6 weeks, you might hear a short representation of that again. Let's jump in today on project delivery methods. When we talk about a project delivery method, I think it's important that we identify what that is, that we're all talking about the same thing, because you may think of it as something a little bit different. What we're talking about today is a system that's used by an owner, typically, for organizing and financing design, construction, operations, maintenance services for the structure of a facility. And it's all about the legal arrangement by which it's done, right? And so in a public environment, like a city or town or government, you really only have what's allowed to you by statute. We're going to go through some of that today. As a public entity, really, the sky's the limit. Whatever that public entity wants to do, or private entity, whatever that private entity wants to do, they can do. So if they can come to an agreement, an arm's length transaction with the contractor or developer, they can really write that however they want. Really doesn't matter. But clearly on the government side, because of the public dollars involved, there are some really strict guidelines that govern that. We're going to talk about some of those specific statutes. So before I jump into this, I should say that we're not attorneys and we're not financial advisors. So we're not going to be giving legal or financial advice today. Unfortunately, if that's what you came for. So if you do feel that you need some of that, I encourage you to call your attorney or call your financial advisor. And if you don't have one of those or need somebody else, we can sure make a recommendation for you. But I wanted to make that statement. So a public work or a public purchase. So under Indiana law, there's a clear difference between a public work and a public purchase. And this is one thing that we help our clients understand each and every day. So public work is the construction or reconstruction or alteration of a public building or any facility, infrastructure, whatever it is. That's paid for out of a public fund or out of a special assessment. This is all in Indiana Code 36-1-12. So examples of this are school buildings, sidewalk projects, water mains, police stations, town hall, whatever you want to consider as a public work. The key here is paid for out of a public fund, right? So the primary consideration in this arrangement is the price. That's how it's selected. So you've heard of this before. They go get bids. They pre-bids. They take the lowest bid. They're almost mandated to take the lowest price at that point based upon however they qualify. The difference between that and a public purchase is more of the purchase, including rent or lease, and this is important, of any property, including equipment, goods, materials, or services for use by a municipality. And so this basic of primary consideration here of this service is in qualifications. And so all of a sudden we've moved to a qualification-based selection versus a price selection. So this is really important to understand if you're helping your clients, cities and towns, or if we're working with our clients to help them understand really what this means and the difference between the two. Because now with some of the statutes we're going to talk about, we've started to shift some of what would normally be considered public works into more of a public purchase scenario, which then opens up the door for a little bit different scenario. Okay. Mark, you taking this one, I think?
Yes. So one of the conversations that we have with our clients in regards to reviewing project delivery methods is risk assessment and identifying how much risk the client is willing to tolerate. So each project delivery method has a certain amount of risk associated with it, and that risk could be associated with cost, with control of the schedule, with control of the design, with legal and financial implications with risk down the road. and then also with risk associated with maintaining your own staff levels, maintaining your own project or government coordination. So there are 4 things you can do with risk. And I apologize, I had something pop up in front of my screen. You can accept it, obviously, and I think you'll recognize this is probably one of the more traditional project delivery methods with the design, bid, build, where that client is taking on the majority of the risk of holding all of the contracts, of being responsible for the schedules, responsible for sometimes public safety in certain situations. You can avoid the risk by utilizing certain contracting methods. You can transfer the risk, or you can reduce the risk. And again, this is all spelled out in when we evaluate each individual project delivery method.
And so this risk really comes in the form of cost. It can come in the form of schedule. Who's taking responsibility for financing the project? How does that look? And then control, like who's controlling the site during construction? Who's controlling the decisions? How does that structure really work with the whole scheme and whole delivery method?
Mm-hmm.
So as far as available project delivery methods for cities and towns, from what we really understand, there's about 6 that are really well codified. And then there's the 7th one at the very bottom, integrated project delivery, has been used on a few different cases and scenarios, mainly around very large construction projects. But the code around it is pretty limited, right? And so it's kind of a special use only. So today, though, we're going to focus on the 4 that are the most bolded here: the design, bid, build, construction manager, agency contract, and then a construction manager as constructor, which is newer, and the build, operate, transfer. The ones we're not going to talk about, design, build, been around for probably 15, 20 years now. It's a little bit different, maybe longer than that, but it's a little bit different. It requires a whole different set of guidelines. It's really more common in K-12 type construction than it is anything else that we've seen. Then you've got the guaranteed energy savings contracts, which we could go into if we had time today. It's governed by IC 36-1-12, but there's a really narrow band of people that go and do those things, the guaranteed energy savings contracts. So, and they're very focused on just that, guaranteed energy savings. So whether it's lighting, or it could be just other utility usage like gas, even sanitary sewer operations, things like that, that really go into the utility side. So today we're going to walk through with you guys over the course of the next 25 minutes or so, these 4, and just kind of explain the differences. And if you have questions on the other ones, we'll be happy to answer them as we can, but just wanted to talk through that. So the first one we wanted to jump into, I think, Mark, you're going to take this one, right?
Yeah, this is, am I muted? No. This is the most traditional delivery method that we see in municipalities. And I would say in recent history, as some of these other delivery methods have become available, we're starting to see municipalities identify that high risk associated with design, bid, build, and look to avoid it or transfer it. So again, back to design, bid, build, this typically incorporates a design team that is contracted through a professional service. That designer then designs the project, and then those documents are put out for bid, and those contracts during that bid are held by the government. And typically we see the lowest, most responsive bid winning that project. There's quite a bit of risk associated with this delivery method because, again, the government unit is holding all of those individual contracts. And should situations arise or issues arise in the project, they're having to spend time going out and identifying these issues and negotiating or arguing with these contractors in order to get the project delivered on time, on budget, and addressing any potential change orders that pop up. So, and again, this is all following the Indiana code and state statute with public bid requirements and going through that public bid process. You also may end up seeing a situation where you end up with a multiple prime contract arrangement. And this is where you'll have a, call it a larger trade or larger scope contractor carry subcontracts underneath him to limit the amount of bid responses coming back for a bid. Now, the issue that you create there is that that front end has to be developed by both either the government unit and the design team, or just the design team. There's a lot of potential for errors to be made in that front end and for scope to be missed ultimately. So through the design bid build process, if you don't have a strong front end, you run the risk of having an incomplete project after you bid. And again, owner's risk on this one is quite high. So in the situation where you don't have multiple prime contracts, you do cast that project into a broader pool of contractors for potential bidders. And again, competition is great, but again, you're probably ending up spending more time managing all those multiple contracts in the long run. Cons, again, you have to take your lowest bid. There's no financing aspect. It's usually funded by bond proceeds. And again, that risk falls entirely on that government agency, on that government unit, and has a ton of risk associated with not only cost, but also schedule, which is critical to the project and to the financing for the project, especially if it's tied to bond proceeds.
So one of the big issues on the design bid build is that typically the contracts, the situation with the design team, and then of course your construction team are often done in isolation, right? So your construction team really isn't selected until after the design is complete. So you don't have this constant interaction between pricing and pre-construction activities going on with a CM firm or a construction general contractor during design. So the design bid build, then you're taking the architect and the engineer's word for it that this building is going to cost you $10 million is the budget you've given them. Then it goes out to bid to the contractors. Contractors bid it, it comes in at 12 million. Now you have a 20% gap. Who's responsible and where does it fall, right? And so that's where that risk is really high, because at the end of the day, you don't have to sign all the contracts. You don't have to do the project as the city or town. But when you've already spent all this money to get to the contract date and to the bid date, and now you've got a decision to make. Do we go find more money, or do we send the designers back to really design us a $10 million building, or what's the situation? So this is, as Mark said before, this is the way the projects have been done for years and years and years and years in the public market. I mean, tens, if not half a century or more, right? So that's the way it's been done for so long. And designers really like it because they get to design in a vacuum. They get to not have all this interference or commentary from a construction manager or anybody else. They want to just control the dialogue with the owner. There's nobody else involved. They control that whole thing and say, trust me, trust me, trust me. I'll get you a $10 million project. And then when it comes back in at 12, there's obviously these different conversations that have to happen at that point. But it just puts the owner in a really bad and uncomfortable position of, man, you told me it was 10. I really love this design. This design looks awesome, but it came back at 12. And the architect saying, well, look, if you love it that much, then just find the extra $2 million and do it. And for some cities and towns and governments, that's not that big of a deal. Some of them have the ability to do that, where others, it's a stretch to get to the 10 million. And so getting from 10 to 12 is just not possible. And so now they're faced with the difficult discussion of how do you get the architect to redesign? Because a lot of times when you ask the architect to take that back down to $10 million, they want to charge you a fee to get back down to where they should have been the first time. So without somebody even like our firm out there, and there's other firms that do this, without our firm out there kind of guiding and directing these owners, they don't necessarily know that there's other ways to do these projects. And that's what we want to kind of talk about today. So on your screen right now, really any public project that you can think of, these are two that we're familiar with. We did not work on Finch Creek Park, but we are familiar with the people who did. And they provided us this information. But this is the one up in Noblesville. This was very clearly a design. Then it was handed over to a construction manager. Then it was bid, and it was a little bit over budget. Civic Green and Mario's Meadows in Yorktown, this was one based upon the funding mechanism that was determined that this is how they really needed to do this, was a design bid build. Fortunately, we had enough contingency. We were the owner's rep for the town of Yorktown on this. We still are working with them. They're building this park in their downtown today. And but this was a design bid build that actually worked out okay because we acted sort of as that sounding board that the construction manager might normally act as during the design process, trying to get real-time numbers, trying to get people to understand what this project was really going to cost. And when it came back in, it came back very, very close to the numbers that we had specified. There was no overage, and the bond numbers were able to cover it.
Now, hey, Tim, real quick, if I can add to that, just thinking about the aspect from the contractor back towards the client or the owner. Sometimes a lot of these projects put out by the municipalities are time sensitive. And if it's bid through a design bid build process and contractors out who are interested in proposing on it are aware of the time frame associated with it, the fees or the cost of those bids ultimately have a premium on it to get that work turned around quickly. The other thing is that in today's, well, let's say pre-COVID-19, with the industry being saturated with projects on both public and private sectors, and there being a shortage in labor and contractors, we're seeing an increase in costs associated with construction in general. So those fees continue to increase and add up, and ultimately whatever savings a municipality was hoping to realize through the design bid build and carrying that risk is lost due to the increased fees associated with construction.
Yeah, very good point.
Now, post COVID-19, hopefully it resets itself and we're going to see some savings on the construction side.
The next one we want to jump into is this construction manager agency. And this is IC code 5-16. I think it's -10 maybe, Mark.
Yeah.
So this one became popular probably about 10 years ago, or maybe probably longer than that, probably about 15 years ago, when construction managers lobbied very hard in the legislature to get it approved that their services could be involved earlier as a professional service and would not need to be bid. So they could be selected outright as a construction management firm prior to any bids being done. They could actually work with the design team throughout construction or throughout design to help do that interaction on the pre-construction side, estimate it, to kind of avoid those things we're just talking about. And then they would act as an agent for the owner. I will just be honest, this is one of my pet peeves. This delivery model, and if there's contractors, construction managers on here today, I'm not really going to apologize for this. But this is a model that is sold to cities and towns all over the state of Indiana and probably all over the country, but specifically with our clients, that we spend more time fixing than we can engaging in real meaningful conversation. This is a very dangerous situation for the owner. And the problem is the construction manager usually doesn't tell them that. So when they get into this situation, they're not familiar with what this really means. And up until even 4 years ago when the CMC came into play, this was really one of the only options to get that construction manager involved early. And so we understand why it happened, but the way it's developed today, there are several firms out there that just go sell this exclusively because they're the best, they're the town manager or the city council's best friend or the mayor's best friend. They're going to make sure everything's taken care of. And I'll tell you, that is all probably true right up until the proverbial stuff hits the fan. And then whose fault is it and who's responsible for it? Well, let's explain how this contract works a little bit. So the graphic on the other side of the page, on the left side of the page, shows that in this case, you have the government unit is going to hold two different contracts, right? They're going to hold the design team contract, then they're going to hold the construction manager's agent contract separately. And then the key here is there's another blue line going down to the general contractor, primes and subs and everybody else. So literally every contract is held by the owner, okay? We did a project, our very first project was a CM agency project as the owner's rep in the city of Lawrenceburg. And in that project, this was the only option we really had at the time in order to get the construction manager involved early to price this thing out. The owner, the city of Lawrenceburg, ended up holding the design contract, which was one group, construction manager contract, which was one group. They had our contract, of course, and then they literally held 71 separate subcontractor agreements as their own agreements, right? So when this happens, now it becomes, if you have a really good CM, and we did have a good CM on that, but what starts to happen over time is they start to pick and choose their battles of what they can and what they can't argue about and against, because they don't hold the contract, right? They just have an agency relationship. So the project is still bid through the normal bidding process. So it goes through the code 36, the normal bidding process. But in this case, again, the owner holds all of them. And this is why we call this very high risk on the owner. Because again, you kind of walk through, and yes, you should have better numbers because the CM's been involved throughout design. But at this point, when it bids, and whatever those are, they are. And now you're taking preferably the lowest number that you can get. You're still adding that project up. So let's even go back to our $10 million example. If our project comes back in at $10 million, and we can say, yes, the design team did their job, the CM did their job, everything's moving forward, this is great. But then now, because the government unit holds the contract, if there's a labor shortage, a material change, anything goes on in that process or during the strike, whatever happening, it all comes down and back to the owner. And in many cases, the CM firm will literally just wipe their hands, hold them up and say, hey, we'll work with you to try to help you on this, but remember, we have no responsibility, right? And so again, we've spent probably more time fixing some of these projects in our last 8 years or 9 years of our company, and trying to move clients out of this now that there are other options, which we're going to go into here in a second. So some pros of this, it's not all bad. Pros of this, it's an established process. And so there's a broad pool of people out there and companies who know how to do this. Unfortunately, there's a lot of them who know exactly how to sell it and not how to tell the clients everything. And so they kind of get into those relationships, and by then it really is just a fee. So maybe it's a 2.5% fee or a 3% fee. They may charge some general conditions. It is cost focused, right? And there is no bidding for the CM itself. So you can literally just select a construction manager. If you have a good friend or if you have a good relationship with a CM firm that you've done other work in the past, you can say, you know what, CM, we really like you guys. We want you to come alongside us and help us with this. There's nothing that, it's just considered a professional service. Again, some of the cons, nearly all of the risk, contractually at least anyway, is shifted directly to the owners, which is a real problem, especially when you have an uneducated owner who doesn't understand what they're really assuming. There's no financing aspect, so it's usually, again, funded by public funds of some way, by bonds, which is why the public bid piece comes in. And so you still have this cost of issuance that comes along with bonds. You still have capitalized interest. You still have debt service reserve in most cases. So if you want to do a $10 million project, you're probably going to have to pull an $11 to $12 million bond to cover all of those costs just to get $10 million of net usable proceeds. All right. So a few projects that we've seen that have been done with this, and I'll explain some of these. The middle one is a park in Brownsburg that we did some work on. The left one, most of you are probably familiar with, it's the Center Green in Fishers. We did not have much to do with this one. This was actually delivered by the developer, I think it was Flaherty & Collins who did the first project there, actually delivered this as part of it because they said, we don't want to build our building without this. And so the city said, well, we'll just hire you as a construction management agent. We'll hold all the contracts and do all the contractual work, but you need to manage the construction side. They manage this as part of their construction. And then the project I was talking about earlier is the Lawrenceburg Event Center and Hotel, which is on the far right, which is a project we're very proud of because at the end of the day, it turned out very nicely and it's a cool project. But $55 million later, in a hotel and an event center, there's people only see this part, right? Which is good that people remember this, but there's a lot of headaches that went into this to get this to there at the end of the day. Mark.
All righty. So construction manager as constructor, a little bit of history on the CMC method. This method was proposed in House Bill 1196 back in March of 2014. And this was really geared towards educational institutions. And then after the educational institutions kind of started utilizing the process, it was then made available to pretty much all government bodies, public agencies in June of 2017. And so construction manager as constructor is somewhat synonymous with the private sector's construction manager at risk. And the at-risk part is the key component to the conversation. So if you look at the chart on the right, we still have a design team contract with the governing agency. And then we also have a direct contract with the construction manager as constructor. But you will also notice that underneath the CMC contract is essentially all of those trade contractors who are building the project. So the construction manager is assuming the risk of the construction project. And that risk is associated with obviously all of those contracts, but then also they are committing to a deadline, a schedule. So they're committing to a delivery date, and they are committing to a guaranteed maximum price. Now, one thing that we've noticed in our interactions with the CMC process to date is that identifying that guaranteed maximum price can potentially occur at multiple different locations or multiple different time frames throughout the design process. Obviously, the earlier on in the design, the construction manager knows he's taking on more risk, so the fees associated with his fee for the work, but then also any contingency fees is going to be significantly higher. So again, this is that construction manager at risk delivery method. One other thing to note in the construction manager actions plan on the next slide, so I'll wait. So again, this is Indiana Code 532, but the construction manager as constructor can self-perform up to 20% of the work. Now, there are some pros and cons associated with just that aspect of the CMC delivery method. Some people will say that it creates some issues with competition for the bid categories in which they're bidding. It is also important to note that should your CMC be interested in bidding on that self-performance, they have to bid on it. They can't just assume that they are taking 20% of that self-performance. They are required to not only bid on it, but also meet their own bid requirements. Another component to the construction manager as constructor method is that it allows the CMC to pre-qualify subcontracts, and that pre-qualification process is not very well defined in the code. You can get pretty darn specific in your pre-qualification. Most construction managers as constructors typically will pre-qualify for financial well-being, and then track record for safety, and then also any legal issues. So this is a delivery method that pushes the risk onto the construction manager, and this is a risk versus reward thing. So if the construction manager is taking on that risk, that fee associated with that contract is typically going to be higher than what you're going to see in the CM agency role. There is a little bit of consideration when communicating to redevelopment commissions or councils on this delivery method that the overall cost of construction could potentially be higher than what you would see in a traditional design bid build. I don't believe that to be the case. At least I've not seen that to be the case at this point in time. But you typically see a higher fee associated with that professional service. Some pros associated with that: you've got that CMC contractor on board pretty much at the same time as the design team, or at least early on in the process, and they're able to give valuable feedback when it comes to budget review. So a lot of the times we'll see a estimate associated with the schematic design, a budget associated with the design development documents. Typically we will see a construction document bid or a construction document estimate before bids go out, and then obviously the bids justify or clarify those assumptions during the estimation process. So there's a lot of cost control, there's a lot of cost overview, there's a lot of constructability review, there's a lot of expertise when it comes to value engineering should that budget start to get out of whack. A pro that I talked about before is construction managers as constructor are required to provide a guaranteed maximum price. And sometimes, typically, we're seeing the construction manager as constructor prefer to execute that GMP amendment after bids have been received. Sometimes you can do it before. Most of the times they're going to prefer that you do it afterwards. Sorry, if we can go to the cons. So one of the cons is it's a relatively new process, and even in the last couple of years, we're starting to see a whole lot more use of the method. But there are a lot of contractors out there that have taken off their construction manager as agent hat and put on the construction manager as constructor hat, but sometimes they forget which project they're on. So there's a little bit of a behavior modification, or just you have to remind them that this is a CMC or a CM at risk situation, and that, hey, contractor, you got to remember that you are assuming the risk. When it comes to discussions around contingency, that always seems to be a soft spot or a talking point for most construction projects, but allocation of construction contingency funds, what's covered in a contingency, what's considered part of that risk that the construction manager is assuming, can be sometimes a gray area. I highly recommend that those conversations are had specifically around the construction contingency early on in the process, so that you guys are both on the same page and can move forward accordingly throughout the project.
Yeah, good, Mark. So I think we've done, Mark can tell me, but I think we're in our 5th or 6th CMC project, large CMC project right now. And these are a couple of them. So Mark is working up in West Lafayette seemingly every day on the Wellness and Aquatic Center. He's also got the City Hall up there, which are both CMC projects. And then we're doing the Carmel Clay Public Library, CMC. We've got Johnson County Public Library getting ready to start CMC. So I would say we're seeing a real big shift away from just the straight construction management agency agreements. And even in these larger complex projects, we're seeing a shift away from design, bid, build, just because I think people have come to understand the value of having the contractor, the construction manager there at the table from the beginning, providing estimates and numbers. And then now that they have the ability to actually shift some of that risk over to the construction manager, this is becoming more and more popular. So when Carmel Clay called us, they had just gone through and they had to lobby through their attorneys and their lobby group. They ended up lobbying the state legislature to get the CMC statutes available for library use, because the way it was originally written, apparently it wasn't. And so Carmel Clay will be the first library done under the CMC model. And then, as I mentioned, we have a couple other ones now. I know we're involved in the Johnson County Public Library. I know West Lafayette's library is going to be done under the CMC model, which again, just provides some additional assurances for owners through the process in order to get that. And so I think we're going to start seeing a shift towards the construction manager as constructor. And then the other one that we're seeing a huge shift towards is this build, operate, transfer. So of the last big 8 projects that we've been a part of, I think one was CM agent. Actually, yeah, so probably of the last 10, one was CM agent, one was design, bid, build, 4 BOT and 4 CMC. So we're starting to see a really shift towards this. So talk about this. This is under statute Indiana Code 523, which is a pretty short read, really, because they've left it very loose. They've left it very vague in many places. But really the idea behind this is you're actually inserting a developer in between the design team, construction team, and the government unit. And so we have introduced this concept to a few different municipalities who have tried it. I think for the most part, it's going very well in most communities that we're working in. People seem to like it because it takes some of the other stuff that they would normally have to be dealing with in their community, like financing, managing the design team, reviewing construction drawings. All these different things now are falling to the developer to do, because at the end of the day, what this really is, this is more of a public purchase, as we talked about before, because you're going to end up buying it with payments or leasing it or whatever the case is. But it's really, the statute is set up for build, operate, and transfer of an asset. Quick history on this, and I don't remember the exact date, but I believe the original statute was written back in like 1978 or 79. It was written very specifically for the construction of the original RCA dome in Marion County. And it was written for project specific, and only in Marion County could it be used, right? So it was dusted off about 6 or 7 years ago when Indianapolis was trying to figure out exactly how to deliver the Justice Center project, which is a huge project for them. They said, they actually put out an RFP and said, how do we get somebody to build this and operate it, and then after some period of time, transfer it back to the city? And somebody says, oh, remember when we did that back with the RCA dome way back when in the early 80s? And so they went back and dusted off this code, which wasn't 523 at the time. I think it was something else. And they decided to bring it to the state legislature to codify it so that they could use it again officially use it for the Justice Center. Well, the state legislature, over the if you've been around Indiana, you've heard over the last 20 years that everybody thinks they legislate just for Marion County. So they made a point to legislate for the whole state, basically saying, we're gonna codify this. We're gonna put it into a form that can be used by any governmental unit. So any governmental unit across the state can use this. There's a few caveats in there, but one of the things is that the governmental unit has to adopt this code as a usable procurement method for their project. So with this, the owner contracts with the developer to build, operate, and then eventually transfer the project. Again, being very vague, it never says you have to operate it for a certain amount of time. You can operate it for 1 year, 2 years, 1 day, a couple hours, doesn't really matter. It doesn't say, right? Usually it's delivered by a lump sum and on a guaranteed price, right? So the developer will work all the way through what they call the scoping period to determine exactly what the owner wants, exactly how much it's going to cost. Then they deliver like a package to you and say, okay, here is the lump sum. And some groups do it, and there's only a few people that are, a few companies that are actually doing these, maybe 4 or 5. You can either deliver it lump sum, you can deliver it guaranteed max. It really kind of depends on which contractor you select or developer you select on their normal method of how they would do this. So with this one, again, some of the pros of this, it tends to be very flexible. So we have done, and I'll show you some pictures here in a second, Town Hall in Yorktown, parking structure in Plainfield was recommended this way. I think Plainfield's moving, and Todd's on here, but I think Plainfield's moving forward with their Town Hall and Performing Arts Center in a similar model. The Made at Plainfield building is being done under the BOT statute. We've got Speedway Town Hall under the BOT statute. I know I'm missing a couple, but there's a few developers out there that have done this and have been pretty good at it for the last 4 or 5 years, and they've probably got 100 projects that we can point to. So it's not like anybody of your clients is going to be the first one that's ever going to use it. It's definitely been used. So the project is private developed, so all the risk for the most part shifts to the BOT developer. So it's got an integrating financing aspect. So the municipality can make payments from almost any source. So whether it's food and beverage tax or bed tax or income tax or TIF revenues or whatever. Some of you are likely familiar with the fact that TIF revenues can't be used according to statute for ongoing operations, right? So if you build a capital project with TIF money, you can't use TIF money to continue to operate that project. It's got to support itself off of either its own operating revenue, or the city has to, or municipal governing body has to allocate additional appropriations, but it can't be TIF money. Well, in this case, if TIF money is pledged for the build, operate, transfer debt service, then the developer could literally operate it for a while. So we're in conversations right now on a park project that they're looking at a BOT model on, where the city wants to build the park, but they don't have the funds yet to do the operations of the park. They want to build it with TIF money. Well, the way that they can get the thing operated is they're going to have the developer own it for 3 years and operate it for 3 years. And they're going to use TIF money to pay for all of that for a period of 3 years. And at the end of 3 years, they're going to turn the project over to the municipality. So again, it is flexible like that. Literally, the banks are now starting to get very used to this model. They get it. They know the developers that are good at it and the ones that are seeking it, and they can help figure it out. The cons here, it's a little bit of a limited bidder pool, right? Where before you might have literally, 10, 20, 30 different companies who would qualify for a CM agency or a CMC or even a design bid build. Here, again, there's 3 or 4 that we know of that are pretty active in the market, in the Indiana market, that are doing this. And really the special piece here is bringing that financing. A lot of people are comfortable with design and construction, but do they have the relationships with the banks? How do they make their money on this? Where does the profit come in for them? How does it work? How does it fit together? So what you're starting to see is some teams. And then the other con on this is the unfamiliar process for cities and towns. We have told some of our clients, I said, have you looked at this opportunity? And they're like, well, we don't understand it. We don't get it, right? And then trying to educate, that education piece is really important. But to educate them to the point where they're comfortable doing it and walking through it, it takes a maverick sometimes to say, yes, we're going to try that thing. It actually isn't that far different from the Guaranteed Energy Savings Contract. The mechanisms are different. But in the Guaranteed Energy Savings Contract that we didn't talk about today, you know, that developer slash construction manager team is bringing financing typically as well. They're using their savings to pay that off. In this case, you're just identifying some revenue stream, which could literally be, it could be a general obligation, could be TIF money, could be all those things that we talked about. So just, it could be a utility fund, lots of different things. So as far as this projects go, it can be done for parks. We've got Yorktown Town Hall on here, Speedway Town Hall. The MAID at Plainfield is a higher education building that our firm is leading Plainfield through right now. The Yorktown Town Hall is actually complete. Speedway Town Hall will be complete later this year. Seymour Park, or Crossroads Park in Seymour is complete. We did not do this one, but one of the developers that I mentioned before did it. So this one comes with a lot of advantages. I think one of the ones that I didn't even put up here as far as pros on the BOT is the speed to market. Literally, you can, instead of going through the normal 6-month bond process and paying your architects and your design team, you know, a couple $100,000 to get you to that scoping period, you can literally be working on design and get to an answer and get to a number and moving in literally about 90 days, right? And so it moves things a lot faster because it's working in the private market to deliver a public project. And I'll throw this out there because it's probably worth some discussion, but there's also some idea that it's not necessarily needed to public bid it, right? So depending on how you read the statute, and there seems to be some disagreement between attorneys, depending on who you talk to, about whether this needs to be publicly bid or not. But most of the projects that we've done it on have not been publicly bid. They've been privately bid, and then they hold them for some period of time. They finance them because they're not using public funds. They're using their own funds as a developer that they pulled from a private bank. Then the project is being basically purchased. It's almost no different than a city or town saying, I really like that office building over there. I want to use that for my town hall. Then they go purchase it. They don't bid that out. They just go and make a public purchase, as we talked about before. So this is the last one that was on our list. We have about 10 minutes left to hold you guys to the hour that we promised. Again, thank you for being on the call today. This is our first one for our lockdown webinar series. Hopefully you can join us over the next 6 weeks or next 5 weeks for a few more. But right now, I think we'll turn to any questions if anybody has them. Marlon, did you see any come in on chat?
Not yet.
Okay, so if you want to unmute yourself, if you have a question or a conversation or a discussion for the group, we'd be happy to take any questions if you have them. No questions. None at all. We did a great job explaining everything. So hearing that there are no questions, obviously, I know, like I said, I know most of you on these calls. So if you have questions, feel free to call us, email us. We'd be happy to answer anything for you. And if you want to connect on something else that you just have a question on, we'd love to be able to help you out a little bit during this time. We'd be happy to do a virtual meeting. I think I've done more virtual meetings in the last 6 weeks than I've ever done in my life. So we're getting very good at them all. So we're thankful for everybody. Thank you, Mark, for helping us out today. Thank you, Marlon, for putting it together. Thank you guys all for attending and listening to us. Hopefully you found something new and helpful. And if we can help in any way, please shoot us a note or give us a call. All right. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.